Gold was not discovered by one civilization and copied by others. That assumption, comfortable, tidy, wrong, dissolves the moment you look at the actual evidence. The ancient Egyptians were treating gold as divine flesh before they had a unified nation. Halfway around the world in Mesoamerica, the Olmec and later the Maya and Aztec were doing the same thing, independently, without any ambassador arriving by boat to explain the arrangement. Ancient China, the Indus Valley, sub-Saharan Africa, each of them in isolation reached the same conclusion about the same metal. None of them could have compared notes. The distances were too vast, the centuries between them too wide. Yet somehow across every ocean and every mountain range and every unconnected stretch of human history, the answer kept coming back identical. This metal is sacred. This metal is beyond ordinary things. This metal belongs to the gods. Science has been trying to explain that for decades. It has not succeeded. To understand why, you first have to understand what gold actually is. Not what it represents, but what it physically does that no other element on Earth does quite the same way. Its density is 19.3 grams per cubic centimetre. Hold a piece the size of your thumb and it will feel almost obscenely heavy. Wrong in your hand, like the laws of weight have been briefly suspended. Its melting point is 1064 degrees Celsius, high enough that you need serious heat to liquefy it, but low enough that ancient peoples with clay furnaces and bellows could actually reach it. That combination matters enormously. Gold sits in a narrow window, demanding enough to require effort, accessible enough that a civilization without modern metallurgy could still work it. Every other metal that is rarer is also harder to process. Every metal that is easier to process is far more common. Gold landed precisely in the gap between impossible and trivial. Then there is the thing that no other metal does. It does not rust. It does not corrode. Drop it in seawater for 1,000 years and pull it out. It looks the same as the day it went in. Bury it in acidic soil for 6 millennia, and it emerges shining. There is something almost philosophically unsettling about a substance that time cannot touch. Every other material that ancient people worked, wood, bone, copper, iron, told them constantly that things decay. Gold refused that message. Gold looked always like the first day, and it was soft, uniquely, stubbornly, usefully soft for a precious metal. You can beat it into sheets thinner than paper. You can draw it into wire. You can press designs into it with a wooden tool. In a world where most hard, shiny things required elaborate technology to shape, gold yielded to human hands with almost suspicious ease. So, rare, heavy, permanent, workable. The first scientific theory, the intrinsic properties argument, says that is enough. Evolution and experience taught early humans to seek durable, rare, malleable resources, and gold checked every box. Its value, on this reading, is not mysterious at all. It is the logical outcome of what gold actually is. But that argument has a serious hole in it. Jade is rare and beautiful. Shells were durable and countable. Obsidian was rarer than gold in many regions and far more practically useful. You could make a cutting edge from obsidian. You cannot make a cutting edge from gold. It is too soft to be a weapon and too heavy to be a building material. In purely functional terms, gold is nearly useless, and yet it was not jade or shells or obsidian that became the universal sacred metal. It was the yellow one, the shining one, the one that looks, on a clear morning, exactly like something the sun left behind. That is the second theory, solar association. The sun was not a metaphor for ancient civilizations. It was the engine of the world, the source of heat and crops and survival, the most obviously powerful thing in existence. Gold is the colour of the sun. and it catches light and throws it back in a way that no other naturally occurring substance quite replicates. The Egyptians called it the flesh of Ra, their sun god, and they were not being poetic. They meant it literally. The Inca called it the sweat of the sun. The Aztec used a word, Teoquitlatl, that translates as something close to divine excrement of the sun. 3 civilizations, no contact, same equation. This yellow metal is a physical piece of the solar body. Compelling, and yet the theory creates its own uncomfortable question. Why did humans across widely separated cultures all independently decide the sun had left physical residue on the earth? Why not a blue metal for the sky? Why not white for the moon, which was equally worshipped? The solar theory explains the veneration but not the specificity. Something deeper may be operating. The third theory moves the frame entirely. Researchers in evolutionary psychology have proposed that human brains carry an inherited preference for shiny, yellow objects, a cognitive bias potentially dating back millions of years before our species fully existed. Glittering surfaces in the natural world, sunlit water, ripe yellow fruit, certain mineral deposits, signalled resources and safety to our ancestors. The brain learned, at a level below conscious reasoning, to treat that particular visual signature as valuable. Gold triggers that ancient response without requiring any cultural scaffolding at all. The attraction on this reading is hardwired, pre-linguistic, older than language and older than religion, genuinely fascinating, also nearly impossible to falsify, which is exactly the problem. You cannot run a controlled experiment on a preference that may be written into the human nervous system before birth. The theory explains everything and proves nothing. The fourth theory is the most pragmatic: trade diffusion. Perhaps gold's sacred status began somewhere specific. One culture, one river valley, one moment, and spread faster than historians have assumed through ancient networks far more extensive than we typically imagine. The apparent simultaneity on this reading is an illusion of our incomplete archaeological record. Except, there is a piece of evidence that makes that explanation almost impossible to sustain, and it is buried in the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. The year is approximately 4600 BCE. There is no writing anywhere on Earth. The wheel has not been invented. The Bronze Age is still 1,000 years away. Agriculture is new enough that the people living near the Black Sea coast are only a few generations removed from hunter-gatherers. And in a place called Varna, excavated in 1972 after a construction worker's mechanical digger struck something unexpected, archaeologists open a cemetery containing over 6,000 graves. What they find stops them cold. Buried in a single grave, catalogued as Grave 43, the body of an adult male, are more than 900 individual gold objects. Gold arm rings, gold beads, a gold penis sheath, a scepter with a gold handle. Gold so densely packed around this one person that it outweighed the total gold found in every other site from this period on Earth combined. The Varna necropolis contains more gold than the rest of the world had apparently seen fit to preserve up to that point. Before writing, before cities, before any of the civilizations we associate with gold's rise. Who was this person? Nobody knows. The grave goods suggest someone with extraordinary status, a chief, a shaman, a priest-king of a society so early we have no name for it. Was the gold a mark of earthly power, proof of what he commanded in life? Was it an offering, a payment to whatever waited on the other side of death? Was it both? Was it something else entirely? Something we lack the conceptual vocabulary to name because the people who buried it left no words behind. The gold survives. The explanation does not. And that gap between what the metal tells us and what we cannot know is not just an archaeological puzzle. It is a window into something stranger. The people who buried this man lived before the civilizations that are supposed to have invented gold's sacred status. The Egyptians who declared gold to be divine flesh were not the beginning. They were continuing something that had already been decided in a place far from Egypt by people who never heard of Ra and never saw the Nile. This is not a story about one people's obsession. It is not even a story about how an idea spread. It is a story about something encoded in the human animal itself, a response to a specific metal so consistent across time and geography that 4 separate scientific theories cannot collectively account for it. The intrinsic properties argument works until you ask why not jade. The solar theory explains devotion without explaining selection. The evolutionary psychology framework is unfalsifiable, and trade diffusion collapses entirely when you stand in front of Grave 43 and do the math on the dates. Every empire you will encounter in this story, every conquest, every monetary system, every financial crisis, every war with gold at its centre, all of it traces back here. To a question nobody has answered. Why did we decide this was the most valuable thing on Earth? Not iron, which built weapons, not copper, which built tools, not salt without which bodies fail, the yellow one, the soft, heavy, permanent, useless for survival yellow one. 6,000 years ago, someone placed 900 pieces of it around a dead man and covered him with earth, and meant something by it that we still cannot fully read. Before we can understand what gold did to the civilizations that came after, we have to follow the thread of what that single act unleashed. Go back further than you think you need to, not to Egypt, not to the first cities rising between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Go back 40,000 years to the caves of Spain, where early Homo sapiens, people with the same brain architecture you have, the same capacity for abstraction and desire, are leaving behind evidence of what they chose to do with their hands when survival was not the immediate demand. They decorated themselves with gold, not tools, not weapons, not objects with any discernible practical function in the daily struggle of Paleolithic life. The gold artifacts recovered from cave sites in Spain dating to approximately 40,000 BCE are ornamental. They exist purely to be seen, to signal something, to mean something to whoever was looking. In a world where human existence was defined by cold and hunger and predation, someone looked at a gleaming yellow piece of metal and thought, I want that near my body. I want that to say something about who I am. That instinct is 40 millennia old. Let that land. Now move forward, not yet to Egypt, to 4600 BCE and the western coast of the Black Sea, to the necropolis at Varna. We've already stood at Grave 43 and looked at what was buried there, but it is worth pausing on what the craftsmanship tells us that the bare catalogue of objects does not. These were not raw nuggets scraped from a riverbed and dropped into a hole. Someone had worked this gold with skill, with time, with intent. The objects had been made, shaped, chosen, placed. The total weight of gold in that single grave exceeded the combined gold found in every other archaeological site from this period anywhere else on Earth. One grave, one person. More gold than the entire rest of the known world had apparently seen fit to preserve up to that moment. The Varna necropolis forces a recalibration of the entire story. Because if gold's sacred significance was already this established, already worth burying in quantities that represent extraordinary community wealth, by 4600 BCE, then the civilizations that supposedly invented gold veneration were not inventing anything. They were inheriting it, building on a foundation laid by people whose names we will never know, in a language that left no record, or expressing beliefs we are still trying to reconstruct from the shape of a scepter and the placement of a sheath. By 3000 BCE, 16 centuries after Grave 43 was sealed, the relationship between humanity and gold becomes systematic, organized, industrial in ambition, if not yet in method. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians are working gold into jewellery of startling sophistication. The royal city-states of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley produce objects in gold that reflect not just wealth, but an entire cosmological worldview. Gold for the gods, gold for the kings who serve the gods, gold as the material of divine proximity. Simultaneously, and the simultaneity matters, because Mesopotamia and Egypt were not operating in isolation but were also not deeply integrated. Egypt turns toward gold with an intensity that will define it for 3,000 years. The Egyptians had a word for it, nebu, gold. And the word did not mean what we mean when we say gold today, commodity, reserve, hedge against inflation, number on a screen. Nebu meant something alive, something cosmological. The ancient Egyptians believed that the flesh of Ra, the sun god himself, was composed of gold, not symbolically, not as a poetic comparison, literally. The divine body was made of this metal, which meant that when the pharaoh, who was Ra's earthly incarnation, wore gold, adorned his throne with gold, was buried encased in gold, he was not decorating himself. He was asserting his nature. Yeah, he was saying, I am not made of the same substance as you. This was not metaphor. This was cosmology. This was the operating system of an entire civilization, and it ran on gold. The mines that fed it were brutal. The Egyptians were pushing into Nubia, south into the upper reaches of the Nile Valley, following veins of gold-bearing quartz into landscapes that were hostile, remote, and that cost lives to work. Ancient records speak of workers who did not come home. The eastern desert mines operated in heat that was deadly, with no shade and unreliable water, worked by prisoners, slaves, and conscripted labourers with no meaningful choice. To extract gold from its quartz matrix, miners first shattered stone with tools and fire, then ground the fragments by hand into powder, then panned the powder in water to separate metal from dust. The ore grades were low enough that staggering quantities of rock had to be processed to yield modest amounts of refined metal. And yet the operation ran continuously. At peaks during the Old Kingdom, Egypt was producing roughly 1 ton of gold per year. That is approximately 32,000 troy ounces, extracted by hand in desert conditions, without explosives or mechanized equipment. Papier recovered from later periods record miners not praying for rescue, not for water, not even for rest, praying for death. The specific language survives. Men underground, breathing rock dust, working with stone tools in heat that could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, asked their gods to end it. The gods apparently did not respond quickly. The gold flowed north to Thebes without pause. The pharaohs knew what the mines were. Their scribes tracked the output, the tonnage, the losses, the need for replacement workers when the previous ones could no longer function. The suffering was not hidden from power. It was produced by power deliberately, because the theological equation demanded gold in quantities that only relentlessness could deliver. Nebu, the flesh of the gods, extracted at the cost of the flesh of men. Consider what survival looks like. The Valley of the Kings, a dry limestone-heavy valley across the Nile from modern Luxor, chosen specifically because its geology discouraged moisture. Dozens of pharaohs buried there, most of their tombs robbed within centuries of sealing. Tomb robbing in ancient Egypt was not a fringe activity. It was practically an industry, and many of the thieves were the same workers who had built the tombs. The men who knew exactly what lay inside. Most pharaohs were robbed. Tutankhamun was not. He died in approximately 1323 BCE, probably around 19 years old. A minor king by the standards of Egypt's long history, his reign lasting only 9 years, his name nearly erased by successors uncomfortable with his theological associations. He might have faded entirely if not for the accident of his tomb's location. Buried in a smaller, less prominent space in the valley, his entrance covered by debris from a later construction project, Tutankhamun lay untouched for 32 centuries. Howard Carter found him on November 4th, 1922, after 5 seasons of careful, increasingly expensive, nearly abandoned excavation. Lord Carnarvon asked through the hole Carter had made in the inner doorway, "Can you see anything?" Carter, who had been staring into the dark with a candle long enough that his eyes had adjusted, taking in something no human being had witnessed since the age of Rameses, replied, "Yes, wonderful things. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. The antechamber alone contained over 700 objects. Gilded couches shaped like animals with eyes that gleamed in the candlelight. Chariots, flowers dried to dust but retaining their shape. And gold. On everything. In everything. Covering surfaces that artisans of the 18th dynasty had spent years preparing so that a dead boy king would have the correct materials around him for what came next. Nothing in that antechamber prepared Carter for the innermost chamber, for the nest of shrines, each fitting inside the next, for the quartzite sarcophagus, for the 3 coffins nested within each other, the outer 2 gilded wood, the innermost something else entirely. 110 kilograms of solid gold. That is the weight of Tutankhamun's innermost coffin. Not gilded, not gold leaf over wood. Solid. Cast and hammered into the shape of a king in the pose of Osiris, lord of the dead, arms crossed, holding crook and flail. When the coffin was finally lifted and weighed by Carter's team, the number was almost incomprehensible. Representing months of continuous output from an Egyptian mine, poured into a single object designed to remain sealed in a dark room for eternity. And the burial mask. 11 kilograms of beaten gold shaped to the face and shoulders of the king, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise, obsidian, and coloured glass in a pattern of such controlled complexity that modern jewellers study it with something close to reverence. It was not made to be seen by the living. It was made to protect a dead king's features on his journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, so that the gods would recognize him as one of their own. To arrive at the judgment hall of Osiris with a face of gold was to arrive as Ra's heir. The mask was not luxury. It was a passport. While Egypt was building this architecture of divine gold in the Nile Valley, something equally significant was happening far to the northeast. Ancient Sumer, the city-state at the mouth of the Euphrates, circa 2500 BCE, one of the most sophisticated urban centres on Earth, a place with writing, mathematics, complex theology, and a priestly class that understood death as a threshold requiring correct preparation. The royal tombs of were excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, the same years Carter was working in Egypt, a coincidence that made the early 20th century an extraordinary moment for our understanding of the ancient world. Queen Puabi was buried with a gold headdress of extraordinary delicacy, hammered leaves of gold threaded onto a structure designed to sit atop a wig of deep blue lapis lazuli, the whole arrangement suggesting flowers blooming from a midnight sky, gold rings on her fingers, a golden drinking cup beside her hand, a cylinder seal inscribed with her name and her title, Nin Queen. Everything about the burial announced someone of supreme authority meeting death without surrendering status. She did not go alone. Woolley found, in the death pit adjacent to her tomb, the remains of dozens of attendants, musicians still with gold-decorated lyres, soldiers with gold helmets, servants with gold vessels. They had walked in. The arrangement of the bodies, the cups found near hands, the positions. The evidence pointed toward a structured ceremony in which these people drank poison, and lay down in formation to die, voluntarily or under pressure that made refusal unthinkable. Either way, they died so that the queen would not travel unaccompanied. Gold marked every person in that pit, not just the queen, the musicians, the guards, even the oxen that had pulled the wagons wore gold ornaments. Gold was not simply a status marker in these tombs. It was the material of transition, the substance that made a body legible to whatever waited on the other side. To cross from life to death correctly, you needed it around you and on you. The Sumerians and the Egyptians reached this conclusion independently, from different theological directions, and arrived at the same material answer: the dead need gold. Which raises a question the archaeology cannot fully resolve. If gold was this sacred, this powerfully connected to divinity and the afterlife, how did it begin its transformation into something you could exchange for grain? The answer is not a single moment, but a slow pressure. Sacred objects circulate. Temples receive them as tribute and sometimes disperse them as payment. Kings who control divine gold also control the labour of the living. The same material that marks the divine body of the pharaoh also moves between trading partners as a unit of account because its properties, scarcity, endurability, recognizability, make it useful for exactly the transactions where trust between strangers requires a neutral anchor. By 1754 BCE, the transformation is explicit. The Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian legal text inscribed on a basalt stele nearly 8 feet tall, now in the Louvre, mentions gold as currency in its provisions governing contracts, wages, and commerce. Specific quantities of gold are stipulated for specific transactions. The metal that Egyptian priests kept in sacred spaces and Sumerian queens wore into the underworld is now being quantified in law codes to settle disputes between merchants. The sacred and the economic are occupying the same substance, and that tension between gold as a divine material and gold as a medium of exchange, between something you bury with the dead and something you use to pay a labourer, never fully resolves. It runs forward through every monetary system, every financial crisis, every moment in which a civilization reaches for gold when it feels the world becoming unstable. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, compressed the whole paradox into a single sentence. Gold is mined with great danger and expense, yet we bury it again with greater. He meant the literal burial, the gold in death tombs, the gold in temple offerings. But the principle extends across everything that follows. What the Old Kingdom built was not just monuments, it was a template, a way of treating one metal as simultaneously the most sacred and the most transactable thing in the world, as simultaneously divine substance and economic unit, as simultaneously what you give to the gods and what you use to settle accounts. Every civilization that followed would inherit this template without necessarily knowing where it came from. But Thebes and Ur were not the only civilizations drawing on those roots. Across the Aegean, a world was forming that would take gold out of the tomb and put it into motion, into trade, into politics, into the engine of something that would eventually look like a global economy. That transformation would not happen gently. It would happen the way most transformations in gold's history happen, through conquest, through accumulation, and through the realization, too late, always too late, that whoever holds the gold holds everything, right up until the moment someone takes it from them. There is a river in western Turkey that once ran gold, not metaphorically, not in the way poets describe a sunset turning water amber. The Pactolus, flowing down from the slopes of Mount Tmolus into the ancient city of Sardis, carried actual gold dust in its current, particles worn from deposits in the mountain above, settling in the riverbed where anyone with patience and a shallow pan could recover them. The Greeks told a story about how it got there, King Midas, having been granted the gift that turned everything he touched to gold, and quickly realizing this included food and water and his daughter, was told by Dionysus to wash himself in the Pactolus to break the curse. The gold transferred from his body into the river and stayed there. Mythology, encoding geology. The river ran gold because the mountain above was rich with it, and around 600 BCE, the people who controlled that river, yes, that mountain, and the trade routes converging on Sardis from every direction were the Lydians, and they were about to do something that would change the architecture of human civilization more completely than any military victory. They were going to invent money, not barter, not gold dust weighed on scales, not rings of metal whose value had to be negotiated every time they changed hands. Standardized coinage, a piece of metal of fixed weight and fixed purity, stamped with the authority of the state, passing between strangers who had never met and never would, both of them accepting it as representing a specific agreed-upon value without argument or measurement. That is an abstraction of stunning sophistication. It requires a population that trusts not just the metal, but the institution behind the stamp. The first coins were electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver occurring in the Pactolus deposits, and their exact composition varied, which created exactly the problem you would expect. Under King Croesus, who came to power around 560 BCE, the Lydians developed the technique of separating gold from silver through cementation and refining, and began minting coins of reliably pure gold and reliably pure silver in standardized weights. The gold stater, stamped with a lion and bull facing each other, word spread fast. Merchants who had spent careers managing the chaos of barter and approximate exchange suddenly had a tool that made transactions legible across language barriers. You did not need to speak Lydian. You trusted the weight, you trusted the stamp, you trusted the institution that had guaranteed both. Croesus became phenomenally, legendarily wealthy, wealthy enough that his name became an idiom for 26 centuries, rich as Croesus. The phrase is still in use. He also made the mistake that wealthy civilizations have made with clockwork regularity across all of recorded history. He asked an oracle whether he should attack Persia. The oracle at Delphi told him that if he crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus heard confirmation. He crossed the Halys in 547 BCE, fought the Persian army under Cyrus the Great to an inconclusive draw, retreated to Sardis for the winter, confident that no army campaigned through the cold months. Cyrus followed him. Sardis fell in 546 BCE. Croesus was captured. The treasury of a civilization that had invented monetary standardization passed in a single military stroke to Persia. The oracle had been exactly right. Croesus had crossed the Halys and destroyed a great empire, his own. What happened next is a study in how gold compounds power. Under Cyrus and his successors, the Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, from Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. Darius the Great set specific tribute amounts in gold and silver for each province, calibrated to local production capacities, enforced by provincial governors with the full weight of Persian military power behind them. Babylon alone owed 1,000 talents of silver annually. Egypt paid 700 talents of silver plus grain. The total annual tribute converted to gold equivalents represented a concentration of wealth that the ancient world had no precedent for. It all went to Persepolis. The treasury there was not a building in the way we usually think of buildings. It was a complex, interconnected storage halls covering an enormous area of the ceremonial capital. Darius began constructing around 515 BCE. The reliefs carved into the Apadana staircase show delegation after delegation approaching with tribute. Lydians bringing gold bracelets and dishes, Armenians with gold vessels, Nubians with ivory and gold rings. The visual record of her empire was a visual record of gold flowing inward from the periphery to the centre. For nearly 2 centuries it accumulated there. Each king added to it. The gold of Lydia and Egypt and Babylon and 20 other provinces, the tribute of a world, sat in Persepolis, growing, waiting. Then, in the spring of 334 BCE, a 22-year-old Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont with 37,000 soldiers and started moving east. Alexander had very little gold when he began. His biographer Plutarch records that he had supplies for only 30 days, was personally in debt, and had distributed virtually all of the Macedonian royal estates to his companions before departing. When asked what he had kept for himself, he reportedly said, "Hope." He was not joking. He was betting everything on velocity and audacity, on the possibility that the Persian Empire would yield its accumulated reserves before his own momentum failed. It yielded. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. 3 major engagements across 5 years, each one opening deeper access to Persian territory, each one transferring control of another treasury. Sardis fell first, then the coastal cities of Asia Minor, then the Levant, then Egypt, then Mesopotamia. At Susa alone, they found 50,000 talents of gold and silver bullion. At Persepolis, the great accumulation of 2 centuries of tribute, the rough consensus among modern historians is that Alexander captured something in the range of 180,000 talents of gold and silver combined. A physical mass of metal that required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to move. The logistics of transporting the Persian treasury were themselves a military operation. Alexander spent it. This is the fact that distinguishes him from every previous accumulator. The pharaohs buried it. The Persians hoarded it. Alexander, with the speed and recklessness that defined everything he did, immediately began paying his soldiers back pay and bonuses, funding new cities across conquered territories, commissioning administrative infrastructure, patronizing artists and scholars and engineers. The gold that had been immobilized at Persepolis for generations began circulating across a vast geographic area in the span of years. The consequences were immediate and disorienting. When you push the equivalent of decades of accumulated tribute into active circulation across a market not expecting it, prices move. They move fast and unpredictably. Inflation spread through the eastern Mediterranean with a speed that contemporaries noticed and struggled to explain. Too much, released too fast, is its own kind of damage. And yet the world that emerged from Alexander's spending was also genuinely more connected. The cities he founded, Alexandria scattered from Egypt to Afghanistan, became nodes in a trade network that persisted long after his death. The influx of Persian gold into Greek hands funded roads and harbours and intellectual institutions. The disruption and the flourishing were not separate phenomena. They were the same phenomenon seen from different positions. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, 32 years old, his empire immediately fracturing into successor kingdoms. But the lesson Cyrus had taught by taking Croesus's reserves, and that Alexander had amplified by taking Persia's, was now the operating principle of every significant power in the Hellenistic world. Gold is not merely the reward of conquest, it is the engine of the next one. Somewhere in the western Mediterranean, a republic called Rome was watching and learning. They would take what Croesus and Darius and Alexander had demonstrated and turn it into something that would run for centuries. But first, they would show the world what happened when the gold stopped being real. Rome did not conquer the world and then look for gold. It conquered the world because it had gold, and it had gold because it built something no previous civilization had managed at that scale. a systematic, engineering-driven, industrially organized process for extracting it directly from the earth. The Spanish mines were the engine. By 50 BCE, Roman operations in the Iberian Peninsula were producing between 6 and 7 tons of gold annually. Roman engineers deployed a technique called ruina montium, the ruin of mountains. They drilled tunnels deep into hillsides, packed them with water channeled through aqueducts from sources sometimes miles away, then released it all at once, the hydraulic pressure collapsing entire hill faces in a single, controlled detonation of water and stone. The exposed rock was then worked by slaves, tens of thousands of them, hauling debris in leather sacks up through tunnels so narrow that a man could not stand upright, breathing air so thick with rock dust that lung disease was not an occupational hazard, but a near certainty. Pliny the Elder, who visited the Spanish mines and recorded what he saw, wrote that Roman engineers redirected rivers and carved through mountains with a confidence that bordered on hubris, noting that the mountains themselves seemed to fall to pieces in submission. He did not seem entirely comfortable with what he was describing. The gold that came out of those mountains ended up eventually in your hand. The aureus! 8.18 grams of nearly pure gold, approximately the size of a modern thumbnail, stamped with the emperor's profile on one face and a symbol of Roman power on the other. A soldier could take his aureus to any market from Britain to Mesopotamia and know, without negotiation, that the merchant on the other side of the transaction would accept it at face value. One aureus bought roughly 10 to 15 pounds of wheat, enough to feed a family for weeks, or a pair of work boots, or 3 days of skilled labour. 25 aurae constituted the annual pay of a Roman legionary in the 1st century CE. Every merchant who accepted one without examination was expressing trust, not in the coin itself, but in the empire that had pledged its reputation to that stamp. Rome had taken what Croesus invented and scaled it into an intercontinental economic operating system. It worked brilliantly for as long as it worked. July 64, see Rome burns. The Great Fire destroys 3 of the city's 14 districts entirely and severely damages 7 more. Nero faces an immediate and staggering financial problem, rebuilding the capital of the world. His vision for the new Rome is grandiose. The Domus Aurea, his personal palace complex, will eventually cover somewhere between 100 and 300 acres. Its dining rooms fitted with rotating ceilings, its walls sheathed in ivory and gold leaf, a colossal bronze statue of himself 30 meters tall at its entrance. The treasury is under pressure, the military is expensive, and everything is expensive. So Nero does something quiet, something he does not announce. He reduces the weight of the aureus from 8.18 grams to 7.27, a reduction of just over 10%. He also lightly reduces the silver content of the denarius, Rome's more common coin. No proclamation, no justification. The coins look the same, the stamp is the same, the face is the same. Functionally, the imperial mint has printed money by stealth, creating new purchasing power by degrading existing value. Someone always notices, not immediately, not loudly. It happens in markets, gradually, as merchants handling large volumes begin to register, through the accumulated feel of thousands of transactions, that something has shifted. The coins are lighter, the gold content is slightly lower. The value guarantee has been quietly renegotiated downward without anyone being consulted. Prices edge upward as sellers demand slightly more coins to represent the same underlying value. Trust, which is not a physical thing but which had been encoded in the physical weight of that coin, begins to fray at the edges, and then the next emperor shaves a little more, and the next. This is not a sudden collapse. It is worse than that. It is a slow, generational, incremental erosion that takes 2 centuries to complete. The aureus declines from 8.18 grams under Augustus to roughly 6.5 under Caracalla. The silver denarius, which had begun at approximately 90% silver, drops below 50% silver content by the early 3rd century, its core increasingly copper, its surface washed in silver just thick enough to maintain the appearance of the original. Caracalla introduces a new coin, the Antoninianus, nominally worth 2 denarii, but containing silver worth only about 1.5. The profit going to the imperial treasury, the loss distributed invisibly across every holder of savings, every soldier accepting his wage, every merchant making change. By the mid-3rd century CE, the Roman monetary system is in genuine disarray. The denarius is approximately 2 to 5% silver. Ancient price records show grain prices rising roughly 700% over the course of the 3rd century. Not because grain became rarer, because the money became worth less. Soldiers demand payment in gold rather than silver, having learned the hard way that denarii are not reliably silver. Taxes begin to be collected in kind, actual grain, actual cloth, actual animals, because the government itself no longer fully trusts the currency it is minting. The administrative sophistication that the monetary system had enabled begins to degrade alongside the metal that had underpinned it. Into this wreckage steps Diocletian. He comes to power in 284 CE as a soldier emperor from Dalmatia, with a soldier's instinct for direct solutions. His reforms include a new gold coin, the solidus, at 4.5 grams of pure gold, restored to reliability by imperial fiat. The solidus will outlast the Western Roman Empire entirely and circulate as the Byzantine solidus for centuries. But Diocletian also does something that fails with such spectacular totality that it becomes a recurring reference point for the limits of political power over economic reality. In 301 CE, he issues the Edictum de Pretius Rerum Venalium, the edict on maximum prices, one of the most ambitious pieces of economic legislation in ancient history. It fixes maximum prices for over 1,200 goods and services: a pound of pork, a measure of wine, a pair of boots, the daily wage of a farm labourer, the fee for a teacher of rhetoric, the price of a camel. It threatens death for anyone charging above the listed maximums. Diocletian's preamble describes merchants as greedily exploiting soldiers and presents the edict as the restoration of justice against selfishness. The edict does not work. Price controls do not address the underlying cause of inflation, in this case, too much debased money chasing too few goods. They merely change where the pain appears. Merchants who cannot sell at the fixed price simply stop selling. Goods disappear from markets. Shortages emerge that had not existed before the law. Within a decade of Diocletian's abdication, the edict is largely ignored, its penalties unenforceable. Did the debasement of gold cause Rome to fall? One answer is yes, at least as a critical contributing factor. The monetary corruption that began with Nero's 10% reduction and compounded across 2 centuries systematically dismantled the economic infrastructure Roman civilization depended on. Long-distance trade requires a reliable medium of exchange. When that reliability collapses, the trade contracts. When revenue becomes unpredictable, military readiness suffers. When frontier legions are paid in debased silver, they look for another paymaster or take what they need from the provinces they were supposed to protect. The debasement is not merely an accounting problem. It is a systemic corrosion of the trust that made complexity possible. The opposing argument, monetary debasement was a symptom of stresses that existed independently: military overextension, political instability that made long-term fiscal planning structurally impossible, plague, climate deterioration, migration pressures from outside the empire's borders. The emperors debased the currency because they needed money to address crises that money alone could not solve. Cause and symptom are not always separable, and in Rome's case, Historians who have spent entire careers on the question still disagree about the proportions. What is not in dispute is the mechanism. Roman civilization extracted gold from mountains at industrial scale, encoded it with the full authority of the state, and then, through accumulated small decisions made under accumulated small pressures, quietly removed the substance while preserving the appearance. The stamp remained. The weight diminished. The trust followed the weight downward. The invisible architecture of an economic system is not visible until it fails. Then you can see exactly what it was made of. West Africa was watching none of this. While Rome's monetary system ground through its long degradation, on the other side of the Sahara, something unprecedented was accumulating. Not in a treasury built from conquest, was not in a mine driven by slave labour through collapsing tunnels, but in the geography of a continent sitting atop the richest goldfields in the known world. And in the hands of a ruler whose wealth was so complete, so overwhelming, that when he finally moved through the world with it, he would break the economy of an entire region simply by being generous. Turn your mental map of the medieval world upside down. The version most people carry places Europe at the centre. Feudal kingdoms, cathedral spires, knights and plagues, and the slow grind toward the Renaissance. Gold in that picture arrives from elsewhere, an exotic substance that the great kings of England and France accumulate in modest quantities and guard with their lives. That picture is accurate as far as it goes. Yet what it omits is everything happening on the other side of the Sahara, in a civilization so wealthy that European monarchies, measured beside it, resembled minor provincial administrators. The Mali Empire in the 14th century controlled a stretch of West Africa running roughly from the Atlantic coast eastward through what is now Senegal, Guinea, Mali and Niger, a territory larger than Western Europe. Beneath it, threaded through the river valleys of its western and central regions, lay the Bambouk and Bure goldfields, not marginal deposits, by the standards of the known medieval world, essentially inexhaustible. Arab geographers who described Mali in the 13th and 14th centuries consistently struggled to find language adequate to the scale they were observing, as European rulers measured their wealth in hundreds or perhaps thousands of pounds of gold, hoarded across decades of careful accumulation. The Mali Empire measured its wealth in the thousands of tons moving annually through its trade networks. Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in 1352, reported the court with a kind of awed precision that reads like a man trying to transcribe something slightly beyond his frame of reference. The man who sat at the centre of all this, in 1312, was Mansa Musa I. Mansa means King of Kings, a title that in Musa's case was not ceremonial inflation. He governed an empire of somewhere between 40 and 60 million people at a time when the entire population of England was around 5 million. Attempting to assign a modern dollar figure to his wealth has become something of an academic sport, by producing numbers so astronomical that economists have requested the exercise simply stop on the grounds that the economic context is so different that comparison becomes meaningless. What can be said with precision is this. Musa controlled the production and export of what scholars estimate was roughly half of the entire world's gold supply at the time. Not half of Africa's, half of the world's. While the Kingdom of France was pledging its treasury as collateral for military campaigns, and the English crown was pawning its crown jewels to fund wars it could barely afford, the court at Niani was casually deciding how much gold to release into Saharan trade routes so as not to depress the price. Then, in 1324, Musa decided to go to Mecca. What followed was not a pilgrimage, it was a migration. 60,000 people accompanied him, a moving city crossing the Sahara, including soldiers, administrators, scholars, poets, architects, and, at the material heart of the procession, 500 slaves each carrying a golden staff, and 100 camels each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. 12,000 personal servants, according to contemporary accounts, each carrying 4 pounds of gold bars. Somewhere in the vicinity of 30,000 pounds of gold dust from the camels alone, before counting anything else. Cairo was the first major stop. What happened over the following weeks was something no city in the medieval world had any protocol for managing. Musa gave, relentlessly, systematically, joyfully, to mosques, substantial endowments, to scholars and religious officials, gold distributed with a generosity that seemed to have no arithmetic behind it. An Egyptian official named Al-Umari, writing about the visit several years later based on interviews with people who had been present, recorded his astonishment with bureaucratic precision. This man flooded Cairo with his gifts to the point that he spoiled the value of currency. Musa had given so much gold that the cumulative effect was a price collapse none of the recipients had anticipated and none of them welcomed. The price of gold in Egypt dropped sharply and stayed down, not for months, for more than a decade. Contemporary Egyptian sources tracking commodity prices show the disruption lasting well into the 1330s, a regional economic depression triggered not by scarcity, not by war, not by crop failure, but by one man's extravagance at a moment of religious devotion. Musa reportedly became aware of what he had done and attempted a partial correction, borrowing gold back from Egyptian merchants at high interest rates, essentially trying to drain some of the excess from circulation. The attempt was genuine. The damage was not fully reversible. The standard story of gold's destructive economic power runs through military conquest, through imperial overextension, through desperate debasement by rulers unable to balance their books. This is something different. A man so wealthy that his charity broke an economy, giving destroyed price stability as efficiently as any conquering army ever had. Back home in Mali, the city of Timbuktu functioned as the intellectual and commercial hub of this gold empire. Gold moved north along the Saharan caravan routes. Salt moved south. Salt being, in the West African interior, genuinely as valuable as gold in direct exchange, a fact that puzzled Mediterranean observers who lived near salt deposits and could not grasp scarcity in that direction. Scholarship moved through Timbuktu in both directions, and the gold that funded commerce also funded the Sank Mosque and University, a centre of Islamic learning that at its peak held perhaps 25,000 students and a library estimated at 700,000 manuscripts. The same metal that had filled Tutankhamun's tomb, that had paid Roman legionaries along Hadrian's Wall, was financing one of the medieval world's greatest intellectual institutions. But the gold was not staying in Mali. It was moving northward through the Saharan caravan routes, through Takhasa and Sijil Masa and Tunis, until it reached the Mediterranean and flowed into the monetary systems of European kingdoms with almost no domestic gold production. The Venetian gold ducat, introduced in 1284 at 3.5 grams of pure gold, achieved its reputation as the most trusted trade coin in the Mediterranean world, in part because Venice was positioned to receive West African gold through North African intermediaries. The monetary architecture of 14th century Europe was not an autonomous European achievement. It was running on African extraction, African labour, African geography, passed through Arab intermediaries who took their margin at each crossing, and ensured that European merchants receiving Malian gold had only a vague sense of where it originated. European cartographers of the period sometimes marked Mali on their maps with a tiny image of a black king holding a golden orb. The Catalan Atlas of 1375 shows Mansa Musa explicitly seated on a throne holding a nugget of gold, captioned with a note about a Lord of Guinea described as the richest and most noble king in all the land. This was not myth. This was market intelligence encoded in cartographic form. The acknowledgement that the gold defining European monetary systems had a source, and the source had a face. Within a generation of Musa's death in approximately 1337, the Mali Empire began to fragment under succession pressures and external raids. The Bamberg and Bure goldfields did not disappear. The trade routes did not close. But somewhere in the archives of Lisbon and Seville and Genoa, and men with access to those maps were reading the same cartographic labels and forming a question that Musa, conducting his pilgrimage through a world he could not have imagined becoming dangerous, had no reason to anticipate. What if you went around the intermediaries entirely? What if you found the source? The question had been forming for decades before anyone had the ships to ask it properly. And when Christopher Columbus finally convinced the Spanish crown to fund an answer in 1492, he was not looking for a new world. He was looking for gold, specifically the gold of Asia that Marco Polo had described 2 centuries earlier in language so extravagant that European readers had assumed exaggeration. Columbus did not think he was exaggerating, he thought he had a route. His journals from those first Atlantic crossings are extraordinary documents, not because of what he found, but because of what he could not stop thinking about while he was finding it. Sailing west through October 1492, he writes about gold the way a man writes about a fever dream, compulsively, circling back, unable to leave it alone. Gold is most excellent. Gold constitutes treasure, and he who has it does all he wants in the world. The indigenous Taino people he encountered wore small gold ornaments in their noses. Columbus noted this immediately and began asking through gestures and improvised sign language where the metal came from. They pointed in several directions. He spent weeks following those gestures around the Caribbean, finding traces, finding promise, never finding the thing itself. He returned to Spain with a small amount of gold, captive Taino people, and a report that made the gold sound more plentiful than it was. He died in 1506 without understanding what he had actually found. The gold he spent his life chasing was not in the islands, it was on the mainland, and Spain would find it, with a violence that made the search itself seem almost innocent by comparison. Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican coast in 1519 with roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a degree of audacity that historians have been struggling to classify ever since. What he encountered was Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the shore by broad stone causeways, populated by somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, larger than London, yet larger than Rome at that moment. Spanish soldiers who walked into it wrote home describing something that had no European frame of reference. Floating gardens, a zoo, a market at Tlatelolco where 60,000 people traded daily, and gold. Gold inlaid in temples, gold worn by the nobility, gold in quantities that made the small ornaments Columbus had catalogued look like a false advertisement. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's soldiers, wrote his memoirs decades later and still could not fully describe the moment they entered the city. We were amazed, and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and buildings rising from the water. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II received Cortés with gifts of gold and featherwork that the Spanish immediately priced in monetary terms, and the Aztecs understood as political ritual. 2 civilizations interacting through the same objects and understanding almost nothing in common about what those objects meant. What happened in Peru 12 years later was something different, something that historians return to with a persistent unease, because the transaction at its centre is among the most morally naked exchanges in the record of human civilization. Francisco Pizarro landed on the Pacific coast of South America in 1532 with 168 men, against an Inca empire stretching 2,500 miles along the Andes, governing perhaps 12 million people, commanding armies in the tens of thousands. The mathematics should not have worked. They worked anyway because Pizarro arrived in the middle of a civil war. Atahualpa had just defeated his half-brother Huascar in a brutal succession struggle, and because smallpox had preceded the Spanish by years, killing the previous Inca emperor and destabilizing everything it touched. At Cajamarca in November 1532, Atahualpa arrived to meet the Spanish carried on a golden litter, surrounded by several thousand attendants, dressed in the full ceremonial authority of the Sapa Inca. What happened next took approximately 30 minutes. Pizarro's forces, hidden in the surrounding buildings, opened fire with arquebuses and charged with cavalry. The sound of firearms and the sight of horses, both unknown to the Inca, created a panic that Atahualpa's attendants, who had come unarmed as a gesture of peaceful intent, could not contain. By nightfall, Atahualpa was a prisoner, and somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 of his retinue were dead. Pizarro had not lost a single soldier. Atahualpa, sitting in captivity and reading his captors with a precision that commands retrospective respect, made a calculation. He understood that the Spanish wanted gold. He understood that he represented leverage. And so he made an offer that has no parallel in the historical record. He would fill the room in which he sat, approximately 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, once with gold to a height of about 8 feet. 2 adjacent rooms with silver. In exchange, he wanted his freedom. The Spanish agreed. What followed, one of the soldiers present later described as incomprehensible, even as he watched it. We were blinded by the quantity. It seemed the very sun had been captured and brought indoors. Gold objects arrived from across the empire. Ceremonial vessels, wall decorations stripped from temples, royal regalia, objects whose religious significance was entirely invisible to the men weighing them. The room filled over several months. Melted Inca gold work became Spanish ingots at a rate of approximately 11 tons. The artistry, the centuries of accumulated craft, the iconographic systems encoded in the metalwork, all of it vanished into the forge. What had been a sacred object in the morning was a bar of quantified metal by afternoon. The ransom was paid, the room was filled. Then the Spanish tried Atahualpa on charges of treason and idolatry, and in August 1533 they garroted him in the public square of Cajamarca. What makes this worth dwelling on is what it reveals about the absolute primacy gold had achieved in the European value system by 1533. An emperor's life, a civilization's sacred heritage, centuries of irreplaceable artistry, all of it legible to the Spanish only in terms of weight. Nothing else in the encounter registered as worth preserving, and somewhere, according to Inca sources the Spanish spent years trying to decode and never successfully did, there was more. When word of Atahualpa's execution reached convoys carrying additional gold to complete the ransom, they stopped, turned around, disappeared into the Andes with a quantity of gold that, by some estimates, would have exceeded the ransom already delivered. The Spanish took everything they could locate. They could not locate everything. The legend of Paititi, the lost city of gold, has driven expeditions through the jungle for 5 centuries. As of today, it remains unfound. What followed in the decades after Cajamarca was extraction, on a scale that the word mining barely captures. The Spanish established the meter system, a forced labour draft requiring indigenous communities to send a portion of their men to work in the mines. In practice, fixed terms became indefinite, and the death rate in the high-altitude operations made the Egyptian quarries of the Old Kingdom look, by comparison, almost temperate. A Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas documented what he saw with a specificity that the Spanish crown found inconvenient and largely ignored. One account in correspondence with Spanish authorities stated with matter-of-fact horror, "If 20 healthy Indians enter on Monday, half may emerge crippled by Saturday." Over the life of the Potosi silver and gold operation, historians estimate 8 million people died in the mines and the forced labour system surrounding them. The mountain was described in Quechua as eating men. Through the 16th century, Spain imported 180 tons of gold from the Americas, along with silver quantities so vast that the global silver supply effectively tripled. The treasure fleet sailing from Havana northward through the Florida Straits carried the extraction of an entire hemisphere to the docks of Seville. For roughly a century, they made Spain the dominant military force in Europe. And then, on July 30th, 1715, 11 ships of the Spanish treasure fleet left Havana together, carrying 14 million pesos worth of gold and silver, delayed cargo from 2 previous years. The ships were heavy. The season was late. A hurricane found them in the Florida Straits on the night of July 30th, and in a few hours drove 10 of the 11 ships onto the reefs of the Florida coast. Over 1,000 people drowned in the dark water. Spanish salvage teams arrived within weeks and recovered what they could reach. What they could not reach remained. Recreational divers off the coast of Fort Pierce and Sebastian Inlet occasionally surface with pieces of 8 or fragments of gold chain pulled from sand that has been shifting around them for 3 centuries. Spain had already demonstrated by 1715 the same paradox that Alexander's spending spree had hinted at in the 4th century BCE. Too much extracted wealth, flooding too quickly into a monetary system, does not create prosperity, it creates inflation. The arrival of American gold and silver into European markets across the 16th century triggered what economic historians call the price revolution, sustained inflation running from roughly 1520 to 1650, during which prices across Europe roughly tripled or quadrupled. Spanish goods became expensive relative to goods produced in England, in the Dutch Republic, and in France. Countries that received the inflationary pressure but could still compete because the gold reached them later and in smaller quantities. The bullion that should have funded industrial development instead funded military campaigns. The endless wars of the Habsburgs, the attempted invasion of England in 1588, the suppression of revolt in the Netherlands that returned no economic value. The gold left Spain almost as fast as it arrived, moving to pay the German bankers and Flemish suppliers and Italian creditors who financed those campaigns. By the early 17th century, Spain was in debt. By the end of the 17th, it was in serious decline. The empire that had extracted 180 tons of gold from the Americas, that had operated the most profitable mining system in human history, Niamwen was poorer for the experience in every structural sense that matters. In institutions, in industry, in the human capital, the meter system had ground into dust in the high Andean mines. Atahualpa had understood value. The Spanish had understood weight. The difference between those two frameworks had consequences that outlasted every ingot that survived the crossing. The morning of January 24th, 1848, started like every other morning at Sutter's Mill. Cold Sierra Nevada air. The sound of the American River running fast through the newly constructed mill race. James Marshall, a carpenter from New Jersey, doing what carpenters do, checking the water channel for debris. Then he stopped. Something caught the light differently than everything else around it. He reached down, pulled it out of the water. A flake, smaller than a fingernail. He bit it, the way any man in 1848 who had heard stories would. It bent. It didn't shatter. His heart, he would later write, began to thump. He gathered a few more pieces, wrapped them in cloth, and walked back to his workers with the kind of forced calm that people use when they're trying not to say what they already know. "Boys," he told them, "I believe I have found a gold mine." He had found something considerably larger than a gold mine. Within weeks, word had slipped out of the Sierra Nevada foothills despite every attempt to contain it. By summer, the secret was a headline. By the end of 1849, what had been a manageable trickle of curious prospectors had become one of the largest voluntary mass migrations in American history. 300,000 people arrived in California between 1848 and 1855, coming overland across the Great Plains and the Rockies, around Cape Horn, or through the malarial shortcut across the Isthmus of Panama. They came from the eastern United States, from Mexico, from Chile, from China, from Australia. They came because James Marshall's small cloth packet of flakes had set off a signal that human beings are apparently constitutionally unable to resist. Gold, found, accessible, yours if you get there fast enough. A man named John Sullivan reportedly pulled $26,000 in gold from a single claim in a week, roughly $1 million in today's terms, extracted from a California stream bed with a pan and a strong back. Stories like that travelled faster than the ships carrying the newspapers that printed them. By 1857, Eva California had produced roughly $2 billion worth of gold in the currency of that era. What that number obscures is the distribution. The men who arrived in 1849 found a landscape already staked and worked by those who had come in 1848. The men who arrived in 1850 found the same thing compounded. The gold was there, but it moved steadily from easily accessible to technically demanding, from river pans to cradle rockers to sluice boxes to hydraulic cannons that blasted entire hillsides with pressurized water, destroying the California landscape in a systematic way that would take generations to partially address. The surface wealth democratized and then concentrated, as surface wealth has a tendency to do, and the man at the center of it watched his world end. John Sutter had built something genuine in the Sacramento Valley before the gold was found. Swiss-born, ambitious, he had established a 50,000-acre agricultural estate called New Helvetia. Farms, a tannery, a fort, a functioning enterprise that employed hundreds and supplied emigrants crossing the Sierra Nevada. He had commissioned the mill. When the gold was found on his land, he tried to secure his legal position. Nothing worked. His workers abandoned the farms for the diggings. Squatters moved onto his land by the thousands. His cattle were slaughtered. His crops rotted. The courts stripped away his legal title piece by piece. He spent the rest of his life, decades, petitioning Congress for compensation and receiving nothing. When he died in 1880, he was living in a Washington boarding house and still waiting for an answer from a government too busy to notice. By this sudden discovery of the gold, he said, all my great plans were destroyed. 300,000 people carried gold fever to California. The fever remade the state, then the country. San Francisco transformed from a settlement of roughly 1,000 people in 1848 to a city of 25,000 by the end of 1849, and kept going. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was in part a response to the discovery. Someone had to connect California to the eastern states reliably, and the economic pressure of the rush made the political will available. The gold rush also embedded something into American cultural imagination that proved remarkably durable: the idea that the land itself contained sudden wealth, that the next creek over, the next hillside, the next morning could change everything. The myth of the individual prospector, self-reliant and potentially lucky, became something close to sacred American ideology. That it proved true for a small minority and ruinous for most did relatively little to tarnish it. 3 years later, the pattern ignited again. In 1851, a shepherd named Edward Hargraves returned to Australia after failing in California and noticed, by his own later testimony, that the geology of the Bathurst region of New South Wales looked remarkably similar to the California foothills. He tried the creeks. He found what he was looking for almost immediately. Within months, the continent was on the move, with tens of thousands abandoning jobs, farms and families for the goldfields at Ballarat and Bendigo. Melbourne, nearest port to the Victorian goldfields, had doubled its population in under a year. The colonial authorities imposed a licence fee on mining, 30 shillings a month, due whether you found gold or not, and enforced it with a heavy-handedness that generated exactly the resentment one might predict. In December 1854, at a stockade on the Eureka goldfield, between 100 and 300 miners who had burned their licences in protest confronted colonial police and soldiers. The battle lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Somewhere between 22 and 30 miners died. The Eureka stockade became, in Australian political memory, a foundational moment in the country's democratic self-conception. A gold rush had catalysed something in Australian political identity that resonated for generations. Then, in 1886, a man named George Harrison was digging foundations near the Witwatersrand Ridge in what was then the South African Republic, and found something that looked familiar. Hard rock, laced with a thin seam of gold-bearing ore. Not placer gold in a riverbed, not a loose nugget, but something structural, geological, embedded in the stone in a way that suggested it went very deep. "This will make my fortune," Harrison reportedly said. He filed a claim. Then he sold it for £10 sterling. £10. He walked away from what would prove to be the largest gold deposit in the history of the world, and then he disappeared. No record of where he went, how he died, or whether he ever understood what he'd surrendered. What he left behind reshaped a continent. Johannesburg did not exist in 1886. By 1896 it had 500,000 people. The Witwatersrand Reef ran for miles, at depths requiring industrial-scale mining, international capital, and a migrant workforce system so exploitative in its structure that its consequences would run through South African political history for the better part of a century. The Rand would ultimately yield an estimated 40% of all the gold ever extracted from the earth across all of human history. 40% of the total. A single geological formation in a country nobody had previously thought of as a gold territory. The discovery also contributed directly to the Anglo-Boer War of 1899, in which Britain, not coincidentally, fought to establish control over a region containing the most productive gold deposit on the planet, and then, a decade after Harrison sold his claim, the fever struck one final time, in a place so remote that reaching it was itself a kind of trial. August 1896, Rabbit Creek, a tributary of the Klondike River in the Yukon Territory of Canada. Skookum Jim Mason, Quiche in the Tagish language, his sister Kate, her husband George Carmack, and several companions found gold in quantities that casual prospectors working the area had missed. Word took nearly a year to reach the outside world. The Yukon in winter was not a place that information left quickly. Then, in July 1897, the steamship Portland docked in Seattle. What came off that ship, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported in a headline that stopped the city cold, was a ton of gold. The actual figure was closer to 2 tons. Passengers disembarked carrying gold dust in jars and leather sacks and baking powder cans, and 100,000 people began moving toward the Klondike almost immediately. The Canadian authorities required each entrant to carry a year's worth of supplies, roughly a ton of goods, over the Chilkoot Pass, a mountain trail so steep that men carried loads in multiple trips. Photographs of the Chilkoot from 1898 show an unbroken line of human beings climbing almost vertically, each carrying a backpack, stretching from base to summit in an uninterrupted chain that looks less like economic migration and more like something from a fever dream. Of the 100,000 who set out, perhaps 30,000 actually reached the Klondike. Of those, perhaps a few thousand found gold in quantities worth mentioning. The creek claims had been staked within days of the initial discovery. They came anyway, because the news that travels is always the news of the man who found it, not the 10,000 who looked and returned empty-handed. 4 great rushes across half a century: California, Australia, the Witwatersrand, the Klondike, each one following the same arc. Discovery, rumour, stampede, the early arrivals finding something real, the later waves finding depleted ground and broken expectations. Each one remaking a landscape and a society faster than either could absorb the change. Each one driven by the same fundamental mechanism that had put 900 gold objects into a grave in Bulgaria 6,500 years earlier, the conviction that gold, found, changes everything. But underneath all of this fever, something structural had been building that dwarfed any individual rush in its implications. Britain had formally adopted the gold standard in 1816, fixing the pound sterling to a specific quantity of gold and committing to convert paper currency to metal on demand. By the 1870s, most major European economies had followed. Germany joined after the Franco-Prussian War. The United States fought a decade of agonizing political battle over the question. William Jennings Bryan delivering his Cross of Gold speech in 1896, arguing that fixing the currency to gold was crucifying American farmers and debtors on a monetary instrument, and then, with the Gold Standard Act of 1900, formally committed to gold alone. By the turn of the 20th century, the global economy operated on a single metallic foundation. Currencies were fixed to gold. International trade was settled in gold. The metal that had been pressed into the earlobe of a Neolithic woman on the Black Sea coast, fashioned into the flesh of a god king in Thebes, weighed against an emperor's ransom on the high Andean plateau, had become the operating system of human civilization on a planetary scale. It was the most consequential thing ever built on a metal, and it was about to be tested in ways that none of the gold rushers, frying their pans in the California sun or hauling their supplies up the Chilkoot Pass, had any reason to anticipate. The architecture that had taken a century to assemble came down in a single summer in August 1914. When the great powers of Europe declared war on each other, they did not announce a monetary policy change. They simply stopped honouring their obligations. One by one, within days of the opening mobilisations, now the major economies suspended gold convertibility. You could no longer walk into a bank in London or Berlin or Paris with your paper currency and demand the metal it represented. The governments needed to print money for shells and rifles and the wages of millions of soldiers, and you cannot print gold. The standard that had governed international trade with remarkable stability for decades, suspended quietly in a matter of weeks. Gold's first great demotion arrived not with a debate or a referendum, but with the administrative convenience of wartime emergency. The war ended, and in 1925 Britain made a decision that economic historians still use as a case study in the consequences of misplaced institutional pride. Chancellor of the Exchequer. Winston Churchill, not yet the figure of legend, returned Britain to the gold standard at its pre-war parity, as though the inflation and fiscal damage of 4 years of industrial warfare had simply not occurred. The economist John Main,